In my 30 years as a high-security prison warden, I learned one universal truth. The most dangerous predators don't live behind iron bars. They live in the suburbs, they wear designer silk, and sometimes they marry into your family. Standing at my son's wedding, watching him kiss his new bride, Isabella, I should have been the happiest mother in the room. But as I looked at her, a cold, familiar shiver crawled down my spine. I knew that smile, not from a family brunch or a holiday photo, but from a grainy, 20-year-old mugshot buried in the dark archives of my former life. Isabella wasn't just my new daughter-in-law. She was a ghost from a prison cell I'd helped lock decades ago. She didn't fall in love with my son for his heart. She targeted him for his bloodline. Her arrival wasn't a romance. It was a calculated long-term siege designed to destroy everything I spent a lifetime building. They think I'm just a retired woman with too much time on her hands. They think I've forgotten the faces of the monsters I once guarded. But a warden never forgets a prisoner's eyes. Today, I'm pulling the files back out. Because this isn't just a wedding. It's a reckoning. And before the honeymoon is over, I'm going to remind Isabella exactly why I was the one holding the keys. And she was the one behind the glass. Buckle up, because at this table, the past isn't dead. It's just hungry. The air in the ballroom of the St. Regis was thick with the scent of 5,000 white lilies and expensive French champagne. It was the kind of wedding that politicians' sons have. An exhibition of power disguised as a celebration of love. My son, Julian, looked radiant. At 32, he was the youngest state senator in the history of our district, a man with a golden future and a smile that could win over any undecided voter. And then there was Isabella. She stood beside him like a statue carved from porcelain. Her lace veil was a masterpiece. Her diamonds were flawless, and her poise was surgical. To the 400 guests in that room, she was the perfect political wife. But to me, she was a ghost. I've spent 30 years of my life in the shadow of stone walls and razor wire. As the warden of Blackwood Penitentiary, I didn't just manage inmates, I studied them. I studied the way they walked, the way they lied to survive. And most importantly, the way their eyes changed when they thought no one was looking. There is a specific kind of stillness in someone who has spent years in a confined space, a predatory patience that civilians don't possess. Isabella had that stillness. It started with her hands. During the exchange of rings, I watched her fingers. They didn't tremble with the nervous energy of a bride. They were steady, too steady. And when the priest spoke of "till death do us part," I saw a flick of movement in her jaw, a rhythmic grinding of the teeth that I'd seen hundreds of times before in the high-security wing. It was the mark of someone suppressing a deep, violent satisfaction. "You look like you've seen a phantom, Mom," Julian whispered to me during the first dance. He leaned in, smelling of expensive cologne and triumph. "Isn't she incredible? She's everything we needed." "She's certainly unforgettable, Julian," I replied, forcing my face into the practiced mask of a proud mother. But as the night wore on, the nagging sensation in my brain became a dull roar. I couldn't place her face, but I could place her energy. I excused myself from the champagne toasts and retreated to the darkened hallway near the library. My heart was hammering against my ribs, not with fear, but with the cold, hard focus of an officer on duty. I pulled out my phone and did something I hadn't done since I retired 3 years ago. I called Marcus, my former head of records at Blackwood. "Evelyn, it's nearly midnight. Is everything okay?" Marcus's voice was thick with sleep. "I need a favor." "Marcus?" "A deep one," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I need you to pull the archived intake photos from the early 2000s, specifically the Women's Auxiliary Wing. I'm looking for a connection to the name Vane or Vance, or anyone related to the Blackwell corruption case." "The Blackwell case?" "Evelyn, that's ancient history. That father and daughter duo, they're either dead or buried in the system." "Just check," I snapped. "Check the visitors' logs, too. Look for a girl who would have been about 12 or 13 back then. A girl who never missed a weekend visit to Cell Block 4. I hung up and looked through the glass doors at the wedding party. Isabella was laughing now, a glass of vintage wine in her hand. She caught my eye for a split second, and the smile stayed on her lips, but it didn't reach her eyes. In that moment, the curtain pulled back. I remembered, 20 years ago. Cell Block 4. I remembered a young girl with the same piercing obsidian eyes, sitting across from a man named Thomas Blackwell, a man I had personally overseen during his stint for embezzlement and organized crime. Blackwell had died in his cell, but not before he made a vow. He had looked me in the eye as he was gasping his last breath and told me that his legacy wouldn't end in a cage. He had a daughter he called his Little Solitaire. Isabella wasn't just a political socialite from a wealthy family in New York. The family she claimed to be from had been defunct for a decade, a shell company of identities. She was Blackwell's revenge. She hadn't just climbed the social ladder. She had built it out of the bones of the people who destroyed her father. And now she was sleeping in the bed of the son of the woman who held the keys to her father's cell. I realized then that this wasn't a wedding. It was an infiltration. Julian wasn't a husband. He was an asset to be liquidated. And I was the only person standing between my son's career and the ghost of a dead man's vengeance. I walked back into the ballroom, my heels clicking on the marble like a countdown. Isabella saw me coming. She tilted her head, a predatory glint in her gaze, and raised her glass in my direction. The game was on. But she forgot one thing. She might be a Blackwell, but I'm still the Warden. And in this house, I'm the one who decides when the lights go out. The honeymoon lasted exactly 10 days, but for me, it felt like a decade of surveillance. When Julian and Isabella returned from the Amalfi Coast, they didn't move into a new condo. No, Isabella had convinced Julian that the family estate was the best place to launch his upcoming gubernatorial campaign. She wanted to be close to the heart of the power. She wanted to be close to me. I watched them from the upper landing as they moved their trunks into the East Wing. Isabella moved with a fluid, haunting grace, directing the movers with the precision of a drill sergeant disguised as a socialite. Every time our eyes met, she offered a thin, enigmatic smile, the kind a predator gives a prey that it's not quite ready to kill yet. In my years at Blackwood, we used a concept called the Panopticon, a prison design where a single watchman could observe all inmates without them knowing if they were being watched. Now, my own home had become that prison. I had hidden cameras in the crown molding, digital sniffers on the Wi-Fi, and a network of old friends who still owed me favors at the Department of Justice. But Isabella was playing a different game. She wasn't just hiding, she was gaslighting. It started with small surgical strikes. My blood pressure medication began to go missing from my bedside table, only to reappear in the kitchen junk drawer a day later. Julian's favorite vintage watch disappeared from his dresser, and Isabella would find it in my knitting basket with a look of feigned concern. "Mom's just getting a bit forgetful, Julian," I heard her whisper in the hallway one night. "The stress of the wedding, your campaign. Maybe we should look into some professional help for her, someone to stay in the house full-time." She wasn't just trying to destroy me. She was trying to institutionalize me. She wanted me declared incompetent so she could control Julian and the Blackwell files I still held without a witness. The turning point came on a rainy Tuesday. Julian was at a fundraiser in the city, leaving the two of us alone in the vast, echoing library. The air was heavy with the smell of old paper and the ozone of the storm outside. Isabella was sitting by the fire, nursing a glass of dark red wine that looked like arterial blood. "You're working very hard, Evelyn," she said, her voice cutting through the silence. She didn't look up from her book. "All those late nights in the study, all those encrypted calls to Marcus. It must be exhausting for a woman of your age." I stopped polishing the silver frame of a family photo. The hair on my neck stood up. "A warden's job is never finished, Isabella. We're trained to spot an anomaly in the system before it becomes a riot." She finally looked up. Her eyes were obsidian, cold and hollow. "My father used to talk about you. He said you were the only one who didn't take a bribe. He called you the Iron Lady. He hated you, but he respected your consistency." The mask was off. The pretense of the perfect bride shattered like glass. "Your father was a thief and a parasite, Isabella," I said, my voice steady and low. "He died in a cage because he thought he was above the law. Is that your plan? To finish his work through my son?" She stood up, walking toward me with a slow, deliberate pace. "My father died because you refused to let him see a specialist when his lungs started to fail. You watched him wither away through a plexiglass window. You think Julian loves you? He loves the image of you. But I know the truth. You're a jailer. You've spent your life locking people in boxes. Now it's my turn to lock you in yours." She leaned in, her breath smelling of expensive Merlot and malice. "I'm already in his head, Evelyn. I've started his new health regimen. Those vitamins he takes every morning, I made them myself. By the time the election rolls around, Julian won't be able to give a speech without my permission. He'll be my puppet, and you'll be in a memory care facility, staring at the walls." I felt a surge of rage, but I suppressed it. In the yard, an inmate who loses his temper loses his life. I needed her to be overconfident. I needed her to believe she had already won. "You're forgetting one thing, Isabella," I whispered back. "I didn't just watch your father. I kept his journals, every name he ever worked with, every account he ever laundered. He didn't leave them to you. He left them in the evidence locker, and I have the only key." Her eyes flickered, a micro-expression of doubt. It was only for a millisecond, but it was enough. She didn't know if I was bluffing. That night, after she retreated to her room, I received a secure file from Marcus. It contained a visitor log from 2005. There was a name Isabella had used before she became Isabella, Maya Blackwell. And there was something else, a financial trail showing that her wealthy New York family was actually a series of trusts funded by the very people my son was now investigating for political corruption. She was using Julian to protect her father's old associates. She was the Trojan horse, and my son was the city about to burn. I sat in the dark, watching the storm lash against the windows. I looked at the vial of vitamins I had managed to swipe from Julian's briefcase earlier that evening. I didn't need a lab to know what was in them, heavy sedatives and neuroblockers. She was lobotomizing his ambition to keep him under her thumb. The audit was no longer about money or revenge. It was about a rescue mission. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I hadn't used in years, the personal line of the governor. "Governor," I said when the line connected, "this is Evelyn Vance. I have a threat to national security sitting at my dinner table, and I'm going to need a tactical team." But as I hung up, I felt a sharp pain in the back of my neck, a stinging sensation like a wasp. I reached back and felt a small feathered dart. I turned around, my vision beginning to blur, and saw Isabella standing in the doorway, holding a pressurized tranquilizer pen, a tool used for aggressive inmates. "The problem with old wardens," she hissed as I felt my knees buckle, "is that they always forget to check their own blind spots." As the darkness rushed in, the last thing I saw was Isabella kneeling over me, her face a mask of cold, triumphant moonlight. The darkness wasn't absolute. It was a hazy, heavy gray, like being submerged in thick oil. My senses returned in fragments, the cold bite of a concrete floor, the smell of damp earth and stale air, and a rhythmic drip, 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 echoing somewhere to my left. I tried to move my hands, but the familiar bite of cold steel told me everything I needed to know. Standard issue Smith & Wesson handcuffs, professional, tight. Isabella hadn't put me in a memory care facility. She had put me in the one place no one would ever look, the old fallout shelter beneath the east wing of the estate, a relic of the Cold War that only Julian and I knew existed. Or so I thought. "Waking up so soon, Warden? You always did have a high tolerance for sedatives." Isabella's voice drifted from the shadows. She stepped into a circle of pale light from a single hanging bulb. She was still wearing her silk robe, looking like a queen visiting a dungeon. In her hand, she held my master key ring, the one that opened every door in this house and every file in my safe. "You've been a busy woman, Evelyn," she said, pacing around me. "The governor? Really? You thought you could call in the cavalry before I finished the job. Fortunately for me, the governor is a man who values his reputation. And Julian's campaign? It's funded by people who would be very disappointed if certain journals were to go public." I didn't answer. I focused on my breathing, slowing my heart rate just like I'd taught the guards to do during hostage negotiations. In a cell, the person who speaks first is the one who is desperate. "Julian thinks you've suffered a nervous breakdown," she continued, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. "He saw you attack me. He saw the stolen vitamins. He's upstairs right now, distraught, being comforted by his loyal wife. By tomorrow, you'll be on a private transport to a facility in upstate New York, a place where the walls are very thick and the staff is very loyal to my father's old payroll." She leaned down, her face inches from mine. "Where are the Blackwell journals, Evelyn? I know they're not in the safe. Tell me, and I'll make sure your facility has a window." I looked her in the eye, and for the first time since I woke up, I smiled. It wasn't a smile of kindness, it was the baring of teeth. "You made a mistake, Maya," I whispered, using her real name. The flinch in her eyes was small, but it was there. "You treated me like a victim. You should have treated me like a warden." "And what is that supposed to mean?" she hissed. "It means that I've spent 30 years watching people try to smuggle things past me. You think I didn't know you were tracking my calls? I wanted you to find the tranquilizer. I wanted you to put me here." Isabella laughed, but the sound was brittle. "Why? To die in a basement?" "No," I said, my voice gaining strength. "To get you to use that key ring. You see, those keys aren't just metal. The moment you took them out of the Faraday bag in my study and brought them down here, they started broadcasting. Every key on that ring has a localized GPS and an audio bug embedded in the fob. And since this shelter is a dead zone for Wi-Fi, the keys automatically switch to a high-frequency emergency signal." Isabella's face went from pale to ashen. She looked down at the keys in her hand, as if they were made of burning coal. "The governor didn't get a call for a tactical team, Maya. He got a live feed. He's been listening to everything you've said for the last 20 minutes, every threat, every admission of drugging my son, every mention of your father's criminal syndicate." As if on cue, the heavy steel door of the shelter groaned. The sound of heavy tactical boots thudded on the stairs above. Isabella lunged for me, her face contorted in a mask of pure, primal rage. But I was already moving. I hadn't been sitting idle. I had spent the last 10 minutes using the jagged edge of a loose floor bolt to weaken the hinge of the handcuffs. With a roar of effort, I snapped the link. It hurt like hell, the steel tearing into my skin. But I was free. I didn't strike her. I did something much more effective. I used a basic pressure point maneuver on her throat, the silent hold, and pinned her against the concrete wall. "The thing about solitary confinement, Maya," I hissed into her ear as she struggled for breath, "is that it only works if you're the one holding the door. But in this house, the walls always talk to the warden." The basement was suddenly flooded with light. "FBI, hands in the air." Julian burst through the door behind the agents, his face a wreckage of confusion and horror. He saw me, bloodied and bruised, and he saw his perfect wife pinned against the wall by the woman she'd claimed was losing her mind. "Mom?" he choked out. I let Isabella slide to the floor, where the agents swarmed her. I walked over to my son, the man who had almost been erased by a dead man's ghost. I didn't hug him. Not yet. I reached into his pocket and pulled out the bottle of vitamins. "Audit's over, Julian," I said, my voice cracking for the first time. "It's time to see what you've been swallowing." I watched them drag Isabella away. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just looked at me with a hatred so pure, it felt like a physical weight. She was her father's daughter to the very end. But as the medics wrapped a blanket around my shoulders, I realized the house was still standing. My son was still alive. And the Blackwell legacy, it was finally, truly, back in a cage. The aftermath of a riot is always quieter than the violence itself. In the weeks that followed Isabella's arrest, or Maya Blackwell, as the federal indictments now called her, the estate felt less like a home and more like a crime scene being meticulously scrubbed. Julian sat in the sunroom, staring out at the frozen lawn. He had lost 15 pounds. His skin had a translucent, sickly quality, a lingering effect of the neuroblockers Isabella had been feeding him. The doctors said he would recover, But the psychological scars were deeper. He wasn't just a victim of a scam. He was a man who had been hollowed out by the person he trusted most. "She almost had me, Mom," he said, his voice barely a shadow of the confident senator he used to be. "I would have signed anything. I would have destroyed my career, the family name, everything." I sat across from him, sipping a cup of black coffee. The handcuffs had left deep purple bruises on my wrists, hidden now by the sleeves of my cardigan. "She didn't just want your career, Julian. She wanted your soul as a trophy for her father. You weren't a husband to her. You were an audit that she failed to balance." But the work wasn't done. A warden knows that catching the ringleader doesn't stop the gang. I spent those long, quiet nights back in my study, going through the Blackwell journals I had actually hidden, not in a safe, but in the most obvious place, the hollowed-out back of my late husband's portrait in the Grand Hall. The journals were a roadmap of corruption. They contained names of judges, contractors, and even 2 high-ranking officials in the state treasury who had been on the Blackwell payroll for decades. Isabella wasn't just acting alone. She was the vanguard for a second generation of the syndicate. I didn't hand the journals over to the local police. I knew the rot went too deep. Instead, I invited Marcus and a specialized team from the Attorney General's office to the house. We spent 72 hours in that library, drinking cold coffee and connecting the dots. One by one, the dominoes began to fall. By the 3rd week, the news was dominated by a political earthquake. Arrest warrants were issued across 3 states. The donors who had been funneling money into Julian's campaign to buy protection were suddenly facing racketeering charges. I watched the televised raids with a grim sense of satisfaction. It was the largest liquidation of a criminal asset in the state's history. Isabella, Maya, tried to cut a deal, of course. She offered to testify against her father's old associates in exchange for a lighter sentence. She thought she could still play the game. But I made sure that didn't happen. I personally met with the prosecutor. "No deals," I told him, sliding a final piece of evidence across the table, a recorded confession from the vitamin vial Isabella didn't know I had. "She's a Blackwell. You don't negotiate with a virus, you eradicate it. She belongs in the high-security wing of Blackwood, and I've already spoken to the current warden. They've prepared a cell for her. No windows, no visitors, just the walls." The final night of the year, Julian and I stood on the balcony. The snow was falling again, soft and silent. The campaign was over. Julian had withdrawn his candidacy to focus on his health, a move that the public saw as an act of integrity rather than weakness. "What now?" Julian asked, looking at me. For the first time, I saw the boy I knew returning to his eyes. "Now, we balance the books, Julian," I said, putting a hand on his shoulder. "We sell the estate. We move somewhere where the air doesn't smell like lilies and secrets. We start over." I looked back at the house one last time. The lights were dimming. The secrets were buried. The Blackwell ghost had finally been laid to rest, not by a bullet, but by a balance sheet. I had spent my life locking people away, thinking that the walls made the world safe. But I learned that the strongest walls are the ones we build around our hearts to keep the truth from getting out. I was a warden to the end, but for the first time in 30 years, I was finally off duty. As we walked toward the car, Julian stopped and looked at the heavy front doors. "Do you think she'll ever get out, Mom?" I smiled, a cold, steady expression that reflected the moonlight. In my experience, Julian, once an account is closed and the assets are seized, there's nothing left to audit. She's exactly where she belongs. I climbed into the passenger seat and closed the door. The click of the lock sounded just like the turn of a key in cell block 4. And for the first time in a long time, I slept the whole way home. The house on the hill stands empty now, a silent monument to a war that no one saw, fought with ledger entries and hidden microphones. Evelyn Vance proved that you don't need a badge to be a guardian, and you don't need a weapon to take down an empire. All you need is the truth, and the courage to audit the ones you love. But what about you? If you were in Evelyn's shoes, could you have sent your own daughter-in-law to a windowless cell? Or would the ties of family have made you blink? The dinner table. Truth is about the stories that happen when the masks come off. If you enjoyed this 35-minute journey into the heart of the Blackwell betrayal, show your support. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and join us for our next sitting. Because at this table, the past is never forgotten, and the truth is always the final word. I'm your narrator, and this has been The Dinner Table Truth. Thank you for listening. We'll see you at the next audit.